The road to her grandmother's house wound like a serpentine ribbon through the darkening forest, the shadows of the trees looming ever closer as the sun sank beneath the horizon. Alice sat in the back seat of her parents' car, clutching her doll to her chest, the fabric of its dress worn and frayed from years of anxious fingers. She had never met her grandmother before. She had only heard stories from her mother, vague tales of a woman who lived alone in a grand, decaying house far from the world Alice knew. As they approached the mansion, Alice pressed her face to the window, her breath fogging the glass. The house stood like a sentinel at the edge of the forest, its once majestic walls now crumbling, ivy crawling up the stone like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the scent of moss and damp earth, and the wind whispered through the trees with a mournful sigh. "Remember to be polite," her mother reminded her as they pulled to a stop in front of the house. "Grandmother is very old, and she may seem strange, but she's family. And it's only for a week, sweetie. We'll be back on Sunday." Alice nodded, but an unease settled in her stomach as she stepped out of the car. The house seemed to watch her, its windows dark and empty, like the hollow eyes of a long-dead creature. The front door creaked open, and her grandmother stood there, a frail figure wrapped in a shawl, her face obscured by shadows. "Welcome," her grandmother's voice rasped, dry as old paper. "Come in, child." The interior of the house was worse than Alice had imagined. The air was musty and heavy with the scent of decay, and the walls were lined with old portraits, their subjects staring out with lifeless eyes. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as her grandmother led her down a long hallway, the dim light of a single candle casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance and writhe of their own accord. "You'll stay in the old nursery," her grandmother said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It's just down this way." The nursery was a relic from another time, its walls covered in faded wallpaper depicting scenes of children playing in a sunlit garden. But the colors were dull and lifeless, as if the joy had been sucked from them long ago. A small bed stood in the corner, its sheets yellowed with age, and a wooden rocking chair sat by the window, swaying slightly as if moved by an unseen hand. Alice's unease grew as the days passed. Her grandmother rarely spoke, spending most of her time in the basement, which she forbade Alice to enter. At night, strange noises echoed through the house, low moans, the creaking of wood, and once, a distant, blood-chilling scream that woke Alice from a restless sleep. She tried to tell her parents, but they dismissed her concerns, attributing them to the vivid imagination of a young girl in an unfamiliar place. One afternoon, while exploring the house, Alice discovered a small door hidden behind a tapestry at the end of the hallway. The door was old, its wood cracked and warped, and it was locked with a heavy iron padlock. Curiosity gnawed at her, and she spent the next few days searching for the key, finally finding it hidden in a drawer in her grandmother's room. That night, after her grandmother had gone to bed, Alice crept down the hallway, the key clutched tightly in her hand. The house was eerily silent, the only sound the soft pad of her bare feet on the cold floor. She reached the door, her heart pounding in her chest, and slowly inserted the key into the lock. The door creaked open with a groan, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. The air was colder here, damp and thick with the scent of earth and something else, something foul. She descended the stairs, each step taking her deeper into the blackness until she reached the bottom. The room before her was small and cramped, the walls lined with shelves filled with jars of strange, unidentifiable substances. In the center of the room was a stone altar, stained dark with something that looked like old blood. But it was what lay beyond the altar that made her heart stop. A large, black stone, rough and uneven, jutted from the ground. It pulsed with a sickly green light, and as Alice stared at it, she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The light seemed to reach out to her, wrapping around her like tendrils, pulling her closer. Her grandmother's voice echoed in the chamber, low and guttural, speaking in a language that made Alice's skin crawl. The old woman emerged from the shadows, her eyes glowing with the same sickly green light, her face twisted into a grotesque grin. "You should not have come here, child," her grandmother hissed. "But now that you have, you cannot leave." Alice tried to run, but her feet would not obey. The light from the stone grew brighter, enveloping her, filling her with a cold, numbing terror. She could feel something inside her changing, twisting, as if her very soul was being torn apart. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was her grandmother's face, no longer human, but a monstrous, writhing mass of flesh and shadow. When Alice's parents arrived the next morning, they found the nursery empty. The villagers searched the forest and the house, but no trace of the girl was ever found. Her grandmother claimed she had left in the night, but the truth was far more horrifying. Deep beneath the house, in that cold, dark chamber, the stone continued to pulse, and the shadows writhed with the echoes of Alice's silent screams.